this is our last session for the day, and I just want to say how happy I am, how well things have gone. I'm really just proud and excited about what's taking place today, and I'm looking forward to the possibilities and just kind of keeping the conversation going, because that's the one thing that happens. Like, we all come together and then we don't see each other for like a year or 2 or 3, and we say, remember when we did such and such? Let's not let that happen with this, okay? And so like, this is meant to be something for us to build on, okay? And so it's now my pleasure to introduce our last session for the day, titled Between Socrates and Grandma, Black-Southern-Philosopher. If you have any questions or comments, again, if you're joining us via Zoom, please put those questions and comments in the chat, use the chat function or the Q&A function. And now I'm just really pleased to introduce our final speaker for the day, and that is Dr. Arnold Farr. Dr. Farr is professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Kentucky in 1996. He became a member of the philosophy department of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he was tenured in 2002. After 12 years at St. Joe's, Dr. Farr was hired by the University of Kentucky. His research interests are German idealism, Marxism, critical theory, philosophy of race, postmodernism, psychoanalysis, and liberation philosophy. He has published numerous articles and book chapters on all of these subjects. He is co-author and co-editor of Marginal Groups and Mainstream American Culture. In 2009, Dr. Farr published Critical Theory and Democratic Vision, Herbert Marcuse, and recent Liberation Philosophies. He is currently working on a book on race, a collection of essays on Marcuse, and a single author manuscript entitled Misrecognitions, Mimetic Rivalry and One-Dimensionality Toward a Critical Theory of Human Conflict. Dr. Farr is also the founder of the International Herbert Marcuse Society, which meets every 2 years. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Farr. I also want to say, Dr. Farr, I'm just like really having a fan academic moment, because I've been reading you since I was a grad student, and you know, you're one of the people that I cited in my dissertation, and it is such a pleasure to like just be among one of the great Africana philosophers, like ever, really ever. So thank you for being here. Our respondents for today's session, last session, Dr. Devin Curry and Dr. Alton Merrill. Dr. Devin Sanchez Curry is assistant professor in philosophy here at WVU. You know what? I don't have your whole bio. Why is that?
I don't know.
Okay.
I sent it to Dylan.
Dylan, can you please email it to me so I can read it? Okay. I'm going to go to Dr. Merrill. I'm sorry, I sent my script. I printed it too soon. Dr. Alton Merrill is a world-class pianist. He has performed and taught throughout the United States, Europe, Asia, and parts of the Caribbean. Dr. Merrill's music artistry is a unique blend of lyrical melodies, rich harmonies, and fluid techniques that span multiple music genres, including jazz, gospel, classical, pop, and rhythm and blues. Dr. Merrill is currently a member of the Pittsburgh Jazz Orchestra and currently professor of jazz piano at West Virginia University. Dr. Merrill is former director of jazz studies at Youngstown State University, and has previously taught at the University of Pittsburgh. Whether performing or teaching, Dr. Merrill incorporates diverse musical styles in his repertoire to minister love and hope to people around the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Merrill. Just read it on your phone. I'm so sorry about this.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's not that impressive of a bio.
I'm sure it's fine. You just cut that out because you're awesome. Dr. Devin Sanchez Curry is assistant professor of philosophy at WVU, teaching courses in philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and philosophy of race. Dr. Curry obtained his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2018 with a dissertation on the science and metaphysics of beliefs. He has published on Descartes' neuropsychological writings, and his most recent research concerns the intersections between scientific and social practices of intelligence ascription. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Curry. Dr. Farr, please.
Testing. Is this? It's working. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Lupe. Thank you for this invitation. I'm kind of intimidated now because you made such glowing comments a moment ago, and I don't know if I can measure up, but I'll try. But thank you all for being here. This has been a lot of fun for me And what's really nice about it is I try to be something of an interdisciplinarian. I do believe that if we're going to understand the human condition, then we can't possibly do it by looking at the human condition through one set of lenses or the lenses of any one discipline, but through a multiplicity of disciplines. Right? And so I'm not an apologetic scholar, but I do work in the area of philosophy of race, and I know that race and identity are two issues that we're dealing with during this conference. And so those are things I do work on. And the title of this session comes from my essay in a book that is the first of its kind. And I want to say more about it later, but this book is edited by Shannon Sullivan, who's a white woman who does philosophy of race and is one of my favorites. And I've been reading and teaching her work for a long time. And I had her come to University of Kentucky to speak in 2018 to a seminar that we had at the time. And we were having a conversation over dinner. And I started talking about grandma metaphysics, which is a term that came to me in a conversation with Cornel West, when I guess it was over 15 years ago. I was trying to explain to him my position regarding my work and regarding religion, which I come from a Christian family, Baptist, but I am myself now agnostic, and I would say agnostic with still Christian sensibilities, if that makes sense, right? And so I was trying to explain to him my existential, not theological, but existential relationship to the religion that I grew up with, and my grandmothers came up in that conversation. And so I was talking to Shannon about that. And she said, oh, that'd be a good idea for a book chapter for my book. And so her book is Thinking the U.S. South, Contemporary Philosophy from Southern Perspectives. And so my piece between Socrates and Grandma, being a Black Southern philosopher, and I won't get into much of the details of that piece right now. I think my respondents are going to say more about some of the content of that piece. I will talk about some of the content of that piece toward the end of my presentation. But what I want to do most of all is sort of talk about the context and the framework of what I was trying to do in that piece. And that means talking a little bit about some very significant problems in the discipline of philosophy itself. So with that, I'll begin. So let me begin by saying this. I'm a freak. Let that marinate for a second. Freak. A fruit too. And I say that because think about it. I'm Black, I'm from the South, and I'm a philosopher. Now, you may not know this, but for most folk, those things don't go together, right? And I can't tell you how many times throughout my career that people found it hard to believe that this old Black boy from the South is also a philosopher. When I taught in Philadelphia, my wife at the time would report to me from time to time about how she and the kids, they were out playing in a park somewhere. And since I was not with them, they said, well, what do your husband do? She said, oh, he's a philosopher over at the university, at St. Joe's University. And they knew my kids were biracial. And since my wife at the time was white, well, of course, I had to be Black. And they would look at her and say, philosophy? And are you serious? And she said, yes. You must be mistaken. They told her she must be mistaken about my occupation, right? And this happened more than once. This happened several times, right? And then they would start guessing other disciplines, Africana studies. Well, I did found the Africana studies program at St. Joseph's, but that was years after the fact, right? I was hired in philosophy. And I just had challenges with people. I'll be on campus and somebody think I'm a non-traditional student. They go there before they go professor, or what are you doing here? Or they would think I was a cook, a janitor, or something like that. And so there's this whole thing of having always to establish myself. No, I'm a real philosopher. And believe it or not, my dissertation was on German idealism, Immanuel Kant and J.G. Fichte. And that area of philosophy, German idealism, is the whitest area of study on Earth, on the planet. And I did a dissertation in that, right? And so there's this whole thing of a kind of philosophy itself as a discipline is kind of a white space, right? Constituted by predominantly white male thinkers with white male concerns. And it has been a struggle for the last several decades for people who are not white males to be included in philosophy. I mean, people who do feminist philosophy, women, have had to struggle. And I remember when I was in grad school, sort of avoiding philosophy of race for a while. And then I was asked by a friend of mine in anthropology to do a lecture on race. And that's when I actually first began to study philosophy of race as a discipline. And I prepared for that talk and I became more and more interested in it, but still held off for a while because, again, someone earlier today talked about being pigeonholed, right? And so, of course, you're a Black guy, you're doing philosophy, you're the philosophy of race guy, right? And all the real philosophy is left to everybody else. And that's really the way they think, right? Now, a couple of problems. This is philosophy is a white space. This is the way in which most people think about philosophy as a white space without admitting that they're thinking about it that way. But the practice is that it's a white space. And even, yes, in a way, in terms of thought, theory, concerns, and even in terms of the demographic, my friend Charles Mills, some of you may know his work, who sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago. But Charles is very dear to me, and I had Charles to speak when I was at St. Joseph's, and also invited him to speak when I was at the University of Kentucky 3 years ago. And when Charles was speaking at St. Joseph's University, he talked about the whiteness of philosophy. And he even did the math and said, you know, if several white male philosophers were on a plane together and the plane went down, it would have no impact on the percentage of white male philosophers at all. And then he says, but Arnold and I, we can't travel together on a plane because if it goes down, it kills both of us, right? That has an enormous impact on the percentage of Black philosophers in the country. And sure enough, a couple of years later after that, there were two conferences back to back. One was at the University of Pennsylvania, the other at Penn State. And a bunch of African-American philosophers, myself, Charles, Lucius Outlaw, Lewis Gordon, Angela Davis, all were at the conference in Philadelphia. And immediately left there to go to the other conference. And I ended up on a plane with Lucius Outlaw, and who's one of the prominent philosophers of race, one of the, I guess, in a way, a founding father of that era, the discipline. And Lou looked up and he and I looked up and saw each other. And Lou says, you got to get off this plane. You know, because so there's that, two things with philosophy. One is, but the problem with philosophers is they claim that somehow philosophy is universal. Philosophical propositions are universal. They almost like a view from nowhere. And that's problematic. In a sense, it's false, right? Now, universalism may play a positive role in two possible ways, right? One is it can provide us with ideals, right? Ideals. It ought to be the case that all people are equal, right? That all people are treated equal, ought to be the case. But in the world where we live, we know that people aren't treated as equals, right? But universal as an ideal, fine. But the universal in the way philosophers tend to use it is highly problematic because they posit universal concepts and ideals without looking at the particular, right? Particular lives, right? And how these particular lives are lived. And so they make grand claims about the human condition, grand claims about freedom that those of us living our lives from day to day do not experience, right? And so philosophers can sort of totally skip the whole thing of human relationships and make grand claims about human beings. And my position is that thought is always located. It is always situated. That doesn't mean that it's completely determined. That doesn't mean that it's totally boxed in, but it starts from somewhere. It starts from a particular place. And as we start from a particular place, we recognize that place, and then we become objective, not by occupying a God's-eye perspective or a view from nowhere. We become objective by enlarging our thought, enlarging our mentality. This means engaging others, engaging those who are different, right? And so this is how we move toward a kind of more universal-like thinking. But you got to do the work, and you got to address the particulars, right, to get to the universal. An example of this, Charles Mills, in one of his books, Blackness Visible, talks about the kind of problems that traditional philosophers tend to be preoccupied with, that if you're a member of an oppressed group, you can't be preoccupied with those problems, right? So, and there's a section where he talks about how philosophers have wasted so much ink on the question of other minds and how do we know other people exist? People really do write about that. And Charles says, you know, if you're Black, or and I'll say, if you're a member of any oppressed group, you know that other people exist. That's not a question for you, right? It's not a question because they got their foot in your neck, right? And you, and your question is, your first philosophical question is, why is this foot on my neck? Yeah. Your second philosophical question is, why don't they get it off? Right? Your third philosophical question is, am I going to have to cut it? Right? And so you're in a very different kind of situation. What human life means is very different for you who belong to an oppressed group. Therefore, the kind of philosophical question you're going to do is going to be very different because you're starting off from a very different place, not a place of luxury, not a place of comfort, not a place of worrying about where your next meal is coming from, or worried about being racially profiled, pulled over, beaten, or shot. Not having to give my son, after a meeting I had at my home a couple of years ago, left home with this hoodie on. And I asked him to pull the hoodie down. And he said, this is a good neighborhood. I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. He said, this is a good neighborhood. I said, that's the problem, right? You're perceived as not belonging here in this neighborhood, right? So you're liable to get shot. So he understood and removed the hoodie. So entering philosophy then, and this applies to other disciplines, not just philosophy. You can think about, some of you do history and sociology, right? You can think about your disciplines and the history of those disciplines, right? And the struggle of women and people of color to enter those disciplines, and right, and sort of then say, here's another piece of the human experience, or here's another piece of history, here's another piece of the social world that you're missing in your analysis, right? I love the work of Patricia Hill Collins in her book, Black Feminist Thought. She begins by, in that first, I think in the introduction, talking about how she's going to break the rules of sociological research, right? Because the methods that she was taught in sociology does not allow her to raise the kind of questions that she wants to raise, right? And so she's concerned about what life is like for Black women, right? Well, that wasn't an area of sociological work at the time she was writing this book, right? And she says, I'm going to do research by talking to my mom, my grandmom, and other women, other Black women, where I was raised, about their experience, right? And so she moves from there, so she violates the rules. And in other words, in all of our disciplines, at some point, there has to be a paradigm shift, right? Where we sort of move away from traditional questions, traditional answers, to a new set of questions that they are new, but then they're not new because they've been questions that have been around all the time. They've just not been allowed in those particular disciplines that some of us were trained in. And so the challenge now is to sort of, I guess, deconstruct, then reconstruct our academic disciplines. And I think Shannon's book is one that kind of does that in a way. This book represents a paradigm shift. It's the first of its kind, right? There's not any other single book out there that we have a group of philosophers thinking the US South, sort of thinking about what does it mean to be a Southern philosopher, right? And so in doing the pieces I did for this book, I had to sort of come to terms with myself as being the target of two different types of stereotypes, right? One stereotype according to race, the other stereotype according to being a Southerner, right? And so this, again, I think it's a paradigm shift. And so I think about, and what she does is she advances this whole book volume, advances this whole process of recognizing the importance of location and situatedness when one begins to think or do any kind of academic inquiry, right? And so another thing I want to deal with coming out of this is the whole notion, and it's been mentioned a few times this last day or two, narrative. I want to talk about narrative. I don't say much about narrative in my piece here, but narrative is always on the table for me because anytime we're talking about identity, I think we have to talk about narrative identity, right? We're narrating creatures, right? The narrative, the story, is what gives life meaning, right? So if you ask me who I am, I'm going to answer that by telling you a certain kind of story, right? And that story will include who I am, what I do, where I've been, who I've been, my past, my place of origin, and maybe something about my anticipations for the future, my hopes for the future, right? So past, present, future, all of that becomes a part of my narrative and my identity, right? And so it's around my story that my life has meaning, right? And I don't have control of that whole story, right? For example, if I had full control of it, I would never be a victim of racism, right? So the fact that I've been a victim of racist behaviors and attitudes suggests I don't have control. Nevertheless, I continue to construct my narrative around those experiences, right? So I can properly interpret those experiences, right? And so what we have then is a macro narrative, a big giant narrative that we have no control over, but we find ourselves inserted into that narrative at birth, right? And then our life history after that becomes our micro narrative, right? So the little story that is told within the larger story, right? So for example, what it means to be an American, right? People talk about the American way or being an American. That's sort of a macro narrative, right? The problem is that macro narrative does not really connect to all individual lives or the particular. Another example of this is a speech from Sojourner Truth that she gave in Akron, Ohio, 1852, maybe, somewhere there about the Ain't I a Woman speech, right? And I don't remember verbatim, but it goes something like this. That man over there says women need help over mud puddles, they need help into carriages, and they need all the best places. Then she goes on, but ain't I a woman? Right? She goes on and on about things she's done, things she's capable of, and she always ends, ain't I a woman, right? And so what she's done is a universal claim has been made, a claim about women, right? But the universal claim was made via the exclusion of women, right? So there's a contradiction, and she's calling out that contradiction, right? Here's what this guy says about women in a universal way, right? But if you look at the experience of particular women, women like me, that doesn't apply, right? So that universal claim is false, right? And unfortunately, my discipline, much as I love it, philosophy, is replete with claims like this, right? So this is why, again, I'm gonna talk about grammar a little bit later, but why grammar is important. So I'll put, we hold up Socrates as sort of the icon of philosophy, the early Greek philosopher who sort of, according to the Western story, really got it all rolling, right? And so we talk about Socrates and the dialectic and the Socratic method, and Socrates is a big hero, right? So if you're a philosopher, then Socrates is sort of the icon, but that excludes so many other fundamental sources of knowledge, right? And I would say sources of knowledge that even rival the knowledge of Socrates. And that is the case because some of us live under certain conditions where another kind of knowledge is more important. Another set of questions is more important. So I want to delve into that in just a moment or two. So another thing I talk about in this context is knowledge and the struggle for selfhood or agency. One of the problems that philosophers have is writing as if we all have agency or an equal amount of agency. They write as if we all, that humanity is just given, right? And they write as if it's not the case that there are those of us who have to struggle for agency. Agency is not just something we have. Agency is a struggle, right? Selfhood is not just something we have, but it is a struggle, right? If you belong to an oppressed group, then you're in a situation where your selfhood, your humanity is constantly being denied. It's not just a given, right? And so it's in bad faith for philosophers to write as if selfhood is just a given. It is something some of us have to fight for, right? And fight for on a daily basis. Right? And so now, given that, we have to really think about then the context of that fight, the context of that struggle, and the kind of resources that are needed if you have to fight for selfhood on a daily basis. And in my article, that's where grandma comes in some ways. But before I get to my grandmas, I want to talk about another grandma, and I'm going to work my way to that by begin with Frederick Douglass and contrast him to the philosopher Hegel, and then talk about, because Douglass is really important in this picture because of his relationship with his grandma Betty, and how he talks about that relationship in his autobiography, right? But before that, someone else that recognizes the importance of Douglas and his relationship to his grandmother was Cynthia Willett. Cynthia Willett wrote a book, very important book several years ago that I teach from time to time, called Maternal Ethics and Other Slave Moralities, right? And she basically, the position in that book is when philosophers attempt to construct moral and ethical theories, one of the problems is they construct those theories as if women and children do not exist, right? And so they miss a fundamental relationship in the first days of one's life that should become a foundation for constructing an ethics or moral philosophy. And in one of the chapters, she contrasts Friedrich G.W.F. Hegel, one of the German idealists, 1770 to 1831, with Frederick Douglass. And Hegel's famous for developing what we call a theory of recognition. And that's important. It's an important development in philosophy because prior to, most philosophers, and even today, still quite a few philosophers, tend to treat the human individual as if we're some atomic, self-contained, isolated individual, right? And there's a failure to look at and take seriously the way in which our personalities or the self develops in relationship to others. Without others, there's no individual, right? And part of who I am as an individual is a result of people who've been in my life. It's a result of relationships that I've been in. It's a result of what I'll talk about later, a holding community, right? But Hegel's account of how we develop selfhood, how we develop consciousness is in chapter 4 of his Phenomenology of Spirit. He talks about two individuals who are just out taking care of themselves, satisfying their needs with nature, and they encounter each other. And when they encounter each other, one wants to be recognized by the other and vice versa, right? And so what happens is, let me make a long story short, they end up in what he calls a struggle for recognition, right? And if you don't give up, one will eventually kill the other, right? And so one of the individuals decides he wants to live. So he gives up, and the one who wins becomes a master, the one who loses becomes a slave, right? That's a long, complicated story, right? But this is how consciousness develops for Hegel, when we have conflict with the other, right? And you've got one who's a master now, one who's a slave, and the slave goes out and cultivates the field and all of that. But the slave begins to realize, but hey, look, I am transforming nature through my labor, and that is a sign of freedom, right? And now the slave has two choices: go back and fight the master again and insist on his freedom, or remain a slave and tell himself. Hegel has three particular stories that the slave tells himself to dupe himself into believing he's free. The problem with that is the way he tells the story, it sounds like you already have two fully formed adults walking through the woods, picking berries, and they encounter each other and fight. And it sounds like you have only two full-fledged adults because Hegel ignores women and children, right? He ignores that these two individuals who confront each other at one point were babies, and they had mothers, fathers, they were part of a community of some sort. And for Willett, this is where consciousness develops. Now, this is where Frederick Douglass is important. How much time do I have? How many? Oh, good. Oh, good. Better than I thought. I can do this, Ann. All right. So in his autobiography, Douglass talks about his relationship with his grandmother in the early pages of the book, just in his entire life, actually. But what I want to focus on is the relationship with his grandmother. I think what a lot of people focus on in his biography is his fight with the slave breaker, Mr. Colby, right? And they think that is a sort of a moment of freedom for him. And I'm arguing that there's a moment of freedom prior to that, a moment that made that second moment of freedom possible, right? And so if you don't know the story, you know, Frederick was sort of an unruly slave. And Mr. Colby was a slave breaker. And so if you had a slave that you couldn't control, you would send that slave to a slave breaker who would whip that slave into shape, okay? And so Douglass was sent to Mr. Colby, and on one particular morning, Douglass wasn't feeling well and wouldn't get up to work. And so Mr. Colby set out to beat Douglass. Douglass fought back and did some pretty serious damage to Mr. Colby, right? Now you would think, well, wouldn't he get in a lot of trouble for that? No, why not? Well, is Mr. Colby, the slave breaker, going to report that he got beat up by a slave? that's kind of bad for business, right? I mean, and so Douglas beat him up and got away with it. He talks about how he felt and the emotions he felt at that time. And it's almost like after that fight, there's a kind of conversion experience, right? And he does speak as if this is a moment of freedom. And in a way it is, but that moment was made possible by his early relationship with his grandmother, right? What happened at that time, Douglas was separated from his mother. I think she was sold to another slave master some distance away. But the function of his grandmother, she raised Douglas, his siblings, and a number of cousins. So when slave women got a little too old to work in the field, they would raise the children of the younger slave women who could still work in the field, right? And so that was her job. And Douglas talks about how the first few years of his life, he didn't know he was a slave, right? He just lived with Grandma Betty and everything was nice living with Grandma Betty. And it was only later that he would find out he was a slave. And once the kids are of a certain age, I think around 7 or so, they're sent to the slave master and sent out to work in the fields, right? But until then, his grandmother raised them. And he talks about the love that his grandmother had for him, how good she made him feel, how powerful she was, and that she was the only authority that he knew nothing about a slave master or anything like that. And as he goes on talking about his grandmother, you can see a deep, strong sense of selfhood being imparted to him in those moments, right? And my position is that's where he was free and the fighting spirit developed, right? It's in that relationship with the grandmother, right? And as he leaves and becomes a slave, he's got to deal with an impossible contradiction, an unsettling contradiction, right? That contradiction is, hey, look, the world around me says to me, I'm nobody, I'm worthless. Right? But the most important person in my life says I'm somebody. Now, what you gonna do with that? Right? I fight too. And so you've got that contradiction, and he lives, his young years, once he's a slave, struggling with this contradiction. And of course, because there's already a strong sense of somebodyness instilled in him, he has the power to fight the slave master and I guess assert freedom at rather a second level, right? So you can already see that Douglas himself struggled with a form of what Du Bois calls double consciousness, right? And so reading Willard's work and thinking about Douglas and my own grandmothers, I contrast I had 4 grandmothers. I had 2, my maternal and paternal grandmother, and then I knew 2 of my great grandmothers actually. And I was very close to one of them. One of my great grandmothers, I say in the piece, she must have died, and I was 13 or 14, but we were really good friends. And I must have been 12 years old, 11, 12 years old, sitting up with her drinking black coffee, So that's how close I was to that particular great grandmother. And so thinking about my relationship with them, and these are people, my great grandmothers were sharecroppers, and my grandparents were sharecroppers, right? So that's how close this stuff is to me, right? And so my paternal grandmother had only a 7th grade education, and my maternal grandmother only an 8th grade education, because they had to go back and work in the fields, in the cotton fields in South Carolina. My maternal grandfather had only a 2nd grade education, right? In fact, my grandmother taught him to read later when they got married, right? And so this is the context, and they're coming out of a place of deep struggle, deep dehumanization, right? And they understand that. And they understand that if you're Black in the South, that you literally have one foot in the grave and another foot on the banana field, right? And so my grandma my paternal grandma was obsessed with educating us and teaching us how to survive. She would make us, we hadn't even gone to kindergarten yet. She would make us recite the ABCs and count, and we had to memorize her name and phone number, and the name and phone number of various relatives. If we got trapped somewhere in trouble, we were little tiny kids, we knew who to call, right? And so there's a kind of knowledge that's required to navigate the world that one lives in, that one does not get from philosophy, right? Because philosophy isn't raising those kinds of questions, right? And so I think that the first order set of questions, right? The kind of questions that you raise and the kind of resources that you need to just survive and to navigate life, the life of a person who belongs to an oppressed group in an oppressive society, right? And so there's that first level of knowledge that grandma gives that Socrates can't possibly give, right? And so, and I think as a scholar, I would be remiss if I didn't really bring proper attention to that kind of knowledge and the importance of that kind of knowledge and the need for that kind of knowledge even today still, right? Now, if I got a few minutes left, I want to do one more thing that I do in the piece, because it's still about being a philosopher from the South also. And so what I talk about is sort of like the way in which the South, and this would apply to Appalachia too, has been stereotyped, right? And stereotyped by other regions of the country, right? And people who have no idea what we actually do and how we live sort of create stereotypes about it. So two stories here. One is when I first moved to Philadelphia, I was a new kid in town, and I was meeting all my new colleagues and things like that. And they would ask me where I'm from. And I remember on one occasion, a colleague asked me where was I from, where was I originally from? And I said, South Carolina. And he looks at me and goes, oh boy, what was it like down there? I said, well, just like it is here, segregated. We had before the civil rights, de jure segregation, right? But you guys have even now de facto segregation. The university where we are right now, the back end of the university, Overbrook community, right? Predominantly Black, poor, right? The other side, I think it's called Ardmore, predominantly white, wealthy, and they pay less taxes, right? And so St. Joe's University is all split in half. City Avenue runs between it, so it's separated from those two communities. And they're professors who intentionally try to teach on the other side to pay less taxes, right? When it snows, which it does a lot in Philadelphia, right? You can just drive around to different neighborhoods and look at where snow removal is taking place, right? It's very clear that some neighborhoods get snow removal, others do not. Guess which ones they are? I'll let you think about that. Right. And so there's that kind of blindness, like, brother, do you not even see what's happening right here? Right. And another one was when I got the invitation to go back to teach at the University of Kentucky. My family and I, we've been vacationing for over 20 years. If you can imagine this, there's a left-wing vacation resort in New Hampshire. I said left-wing vacation resort in New Hampshire. And it's called World Fellowship Center. You can Google it and look it up. It's a wonderful place. We go there every year. And a lot of the people who go there are, I guess, predominantly white liberals from Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And when my kids and I go up, I guess it was summer 2008, because I was getting ready to move to Kentucky. And they found out that I was leaving Philadelphia and moving to Kentucky. You would not believe how many people looked at me with an eye of pity and said to me, Kentucky, why are you going down there? And they frowned. Why are you going down there? Twisted faces, right? And because of that stereotype about Kentucky. And even to this day, that was 13 years ago. I'll even go now and someone would look at me with an eye of pity and say, how are things in Kentucky? Great. Just the same as they are in Boston and New York. You got good people, you got assholes, and you got people trying to do something about the assholes everywhere you go. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And Shannon Sullivan, another one of her books that I draw from in this essay, I think she does a very good job in sort of talking about that phenomenon too, and talking about how there's this notion or a sense in the North of white purity, right? And those who are in the North sort of have the sense of white purity, and they look down on those in the South because, there's a whole white trash phenomenon over there, looking down, and it sort of gives themselves a chance to pat themselves on the back, right? And I've had this discussion with many people many times, especially when I go to New Hampshire, who want to pretend that there's not that much racism in the North. And there's all kinds of evidence against it. And they can do that because they all live in the same neighborhood, same communities, right? And so you surround yourself with a bunch of white liberals like yourself, and you don't go to the ghettos. The ghettos are in Boston, in New York, right? And you just don't go, you pretend they're not there, right? And you pat yourself on the back for having the right ideas. And that's about it, right? Just having the right ideas. And this, I had this book by Angela Davis, Women, Class, Race and Class, and I brought it because she talks about this kind of phenomenon. And quickly, she talks about how the women's suffrage movement kind of grew out of the slave abolitionism, right? And that happened because white women who were abolitionists realized that they weren't giving enough voice to be abolitionists because of their second-class citizenship as women. So they needed to fight for women's rights in order to be abolitionists and fight for the end of slavery. But when more and more Black women tried to get involved, there was a kind of resistance. She talked about various meetings between these different groups and where the Black women were rejected, and goes on to point out that although these white women were abolitionists, they were still racist. And you can be both. Abraham Lincoln was both, right? And again, another book that comes to mind here is a book by James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, a book called Martin and Malcolm in America, Dream or Nightmare. And again, he does a wonderful job of sort of talking about the need for somebody like Malcolm up north, right? And why King didn't have such traction up north. Malcolm had much more traction in the big northern cities because he responded to the unique form of racism that was happening in the North. You had racism in the North and the South, but different forms of racism. So the question is, what is a form of racism that's taking place in the North, right? And I bring all that up because, again, sort of trying to bring light to encounter the way in which Southerners are stereotyped by our Northern friends. And again, it gives them a chance to pat themselves on the back and not recognize the problems that are right there before their own eyes, right? So in a way, the South and even Appalachia has become a bit of a scapegoat for people who are in other regions of the country, where the problems of race and issues of economic injustice and all that, sexism, homophobia, is just as deep as it is anywhere else, right? So I think I'm gonna stop there and let my partners take over here. So thank you.
So thanks to Lupe and Dylan for bringing us all together. Like Professor Farr, my research has brought me to a lot of interdisciplinary events, but I've never been to an event that has as much engagement between people from different disciplines as we've seen today. I think that's really a credit to Lupe. And thanks too to Professor Farr for such a thought-provoking chapter, and then a whole nother thought-provoking set of remarks today that have plunged me even deeper. I'm going to read from a prepared script because otherwise I'd never be able to dig myself out in my 15 allotted minutes, and I don't want to do that to all of you. So Professor Farr rightly admonishes our shared home discipline of philosophy for its tendency to ignore the ramifications, including the distinctively philosophical ramifications of how people are situated in the world. Now, despite agreeing about that unfortunate tendency of our discipline, Farr and I are philosophers, and philosophers love to quibble. So on another occasion, I'd probably jump to the defense of my dude Descartes in response to some offhanded remarks that Farr makes in his chapter about the Cartesian subject as occupying the view from nowhere that he mentioned. I'd point out that Descartes' neurophysiological writings actually reveal an extraordinary sensitivity to the differences between embodied human psychologies, including differences due to personal histories of trauma. But I'm getting carried away. This is definitely not the occasion for that particular batch of scholarly quibbles. Even a philosopher can recognize that it would be perverse to use one's time during a roundtable on Black agency in Appalachia to talk about a lily white Frenchman. Though I can't help but sneak in the fact that Descartes was among the woefully few great white hopes of early modern philosophy who didn't feel the need to publish a racist screed masquerading as armchair anthropology. The Humeans and Kantians, and I'm sad to say Hegelians among my colleagues have more to answer for. Anyway, having got that off my chest, instead of fixating on something Baroque to quibble about, like Descartes' lesser known scientific works, I'm going to use my time as follows. First, I want to register my deep agreement with Farr's opening admonition of philosophy for too often ignoring place, embodiment, and situation, and the idiosyncrasies of perspective that arise therefrom. The main aim of most of my own writing has been to get philosophers of mind and psychologists to realize that it would do them well to pay more attention to ways in which people are different from one another, including when those individual differences are rooted in cultural differences. I'll presently talk about how my most recent writing in this vein can help illuminate a subtle dimension of Farr's notion of grandma metaphysics. Then I'll wrap up by discussing the ramifications that I think taking Farr's admonition seriously should have for how we think about the value of diversity in academia and in Appalachian communities. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey, but I promise I'm going to bring it back home to the theme of the event. All right. So as Lupe mentioned, my current research focuses on the scientific study of a phenomenon that Professor Farr mentions in his chapter, the human social practice, really social practices, of ascribing degrees of intelligence to oneself and to other people. Farr, in his chapter, writes that, quote, "My entrance into the field of philosophy was marked by two distinct but related worries. The first was my Blackness, the second was being a Southerner. Both were sources of self-doubt. Both worries were rooted in two different perceptions of intelligence." Now, I think there are two things going on here. The first, most obvious thing, is that due to racism and anti-Southern prejudice, people have often assumed that Black people and Southerners, and especially Black Southerners, are not very smart, according to whatever conception of intelligence the racist Yankee in question is operating with, which is quite often roughly the same conception that guides the construction of IQ tests. This pair of bigoted assumptions is so widespread and so rarely actively counteracted that it led Farr to doubt his own intelligence, at least when measuring himself up against the racist standards, even though it ought to be obvious to anybody who listens to him speak that Farr has a plenty high IQ. So that's the first thing that's going on. But in his discussion of grandma metaphysics, Professor Farr also puts his finger on a second, more interesting thing. And that's the fact, which I already alluded to in my framing of the first thing, that different people wield different conceptions of intelligence, different ideas about what makes somebody smart or stupid. Entering the field of philosophy involves entering a social world that's in many ways dominated by the same IQ adjacent conceptions of intelligence that are historically entangled with both racism and anti-Southern bias. But that's not the only viable conception of intelligence operative in human communities. There's a widespread assumption that conceptions of intelligence primarily reflect the manners in which well-functioning minds operate. I don't think that's true. I think they primarily reflect people's values, and I'd add the narratives that they tell about it themselves and each other. Intelligence isn't an intrinsic feature of brains or cognitive systems. It isn't a functional moving part of our minds, like our face recognition mechanisms, or working memory capacity, or ability to imagine a unicorn. Instead, an emerging consensus among cognitive scientists holds that the many phenomena that people call intelligence, including the phenomena measured by IQ tests, emerge from dynamic patterns of cognitive functioning that don't themselves form a coherent functional unit at cognitive, psychological, or neuroscientific levels of explanation. The upshot of all that jargon I just spewed is this: intelligence isn't something that scientists find it useful to posit when explaining how your brain works. Now, this is a somewhat subtle point. After all, as neuroscience matures, scientists are, of course, increasingly capable of taking note of how the brain of an unusually intelligent person works differently than the brain of a less intelligent person. But doing so relies entirely on a prior conception of intelligence that was never itself articulated for scientifically well-motivated reasons. Consider an overly simplified analogy. I can make up a pair of terms, blorgle-minded and schmorgle-minded. Blorgle-minded people are people who both roll past stop signs and who always call their grandma on Mother's Day. Schmorgle-minded people are people who make full stops at stop signs and who don't always call their grandma on Mother's Day. If scientists were to study the brains of the blorgle-minded and the schmorgle-minded, Respectively, they'd find differences. There must be something going on in Blorgle brains that makes the Blorgle-minded act differently than the Schmorgle-minded. But that's a very bad reason to take Blorgle-mindedness to be a useful category for scientific theories of how our minds work. So with some minor caveats that I'll spare you today, we can talk about it over drinks later if you like, the same goes for intelligence. It simply hasn't proven to be a useful category for scientific theories of how our minds work, despite the fact that there are, of course, differences between an Einstein's brain and a Homer Simpson's brain. Here's something else that the toy case of Blorgle-mindedness may explain. Which patterns and how people think we pay attention to depends on what we, the people paying attention to the patterns, care about. You can begin to see what I meant when I said that conceptions of intelligence primarily reflect people's values. We didn't have a name for the Blorgle-minded until I made one up, simply because nobody has ever had reason to care about the category of people who roll past stop signs and call their grandmas. There are an indefinite number of patterns in people's mental capacities and tendencies that we could name and track. But we don't talk about the vast majority of them because we don't care. We do talk about people's intelligence. Indeed, unsurprisingly to anybody who hangs out with humans, corpus data show that we talk about people being stupid a lot. We do care about whatever patterns of cognitive functioning we're glomming onto in that talk of intelligence. But there's the rub. That's patterns, not pattern. Research in cross-cultural psychology has shown that there are many different patterns of cognitive capacities and tendencies that people attempt to describe when they call someone smart or stupid. To paraphrase Farr, in a quote from his chapter, there's no truly general concept of intelligence. Particular conceptions of intelligence always occur at a specific time and place among particular human individuals and communities. What we mean when we talk about intelligence depends to a significant degree on the idiosyncratic context in which we live our lives, paired with our idiosyncratic values. IQ tests pick out a particular, historically idiosyncratic conception of intelligence that became particularly popular in the 20th century, alongside the development of IQ tests themselves, and not coincidentally, alongside the development of eugenics. But the variety of intelligence measured by IQ tests is by no means the only variety of intelligence that ordinary people care about. And since there's no such thing as capital I intelligence, qua intrinsic feature of human cognitive systems or brains, there's also no theoretically sound reason to think of IQ-style intelligence as any more real than any other variety of intelligence that people usefully ascribe to one another. So back to grandma metaphysics. Farr vividly illustrates the particular conception of intelligence, an attendant conception of wisdom that was integral to the Black Southern community in which he was raised. This conception of wisdom, he writes, quote, was rooted in his grandmother's knowledge of dangerous forces in this world, as well as a strong faith in a God who would help them overcome. Even while being firmly and singularly rooted in the Southern Black experience, grandma metaphysics would strike many people around the globe as familiar. When cross-cultural psychologists examine the patterns that people have in mind when they talk about what makes somebody smart, both capacities that Farr mentions, a kind of spiritual and moral clarity and a keen sense of how to thrive in a dangerous world, frequently make the list. Here's an example. People living in Usenge, Kenya, reliably rate kids who get straight A's in school as less intelligent than kids who do poorly in school, but are better at telling apart different types of herbs. The latter is a valued intellectual skill, despite being uncorrelated or even negatively correlated with IQ, depending on the IQ test administered. After all, 95% of children in Usenge are afflicted with parasite-borne illnesses, which are treated with herbal medicines. To be very clear, the point here is not that people from Usenge or South Carolina or West Virginia are any less likely to have a high IQ than people from Cambridge, Massachusetts or Stanford, California, all other things equal. The point is that because all other things are never equal, people from the former places are less likely to conceptualize intelligence as equivalent to IQ. In a dangerous world, many people quite reasonably value skipping school to practice survival skills and mold their conceptions of intelligence according to such values. Okay, so what about in a less dangerous world, the world of academia, for instance? Too often, well-intentioned calls to diversify the profession of academic philosophy seem to be motivated by brute desires for demographic representation, or at best, by appeals to the epistemic benefits of diversity, which assume that the epistemic ideals already pursued by mainstream white, male, Anglo and European philosophers are the only proper epistemic ideals for philosophers to pursue. Neither of these motivations involve serious reflection on whether philosophy is good for minoritized practitioners. They involve asking only whether diversity is good for philosophy. And even there, the varieties of diversity under consideration and ways they might be good for philosophy are sharply delimited. I take Professor Farr to be encouraging us to consider a better question, and to be proposing an answer to that question that offers a better rationale for enjoining more and more different voices to join the philosophical choir. The better question is, what should we be valuing when we value what philosophers do? And what conceptions of philosophical intelligence should we cultivate in accordance with those values? Farr makes a compelling case that philosophers ought to cultivate his grandmother's varieties of smarts, indeed of wisdom, alongside Socrates's, neither of which, I hasten to add, has all that much to do with IQ style intelligence. With the IQ style intelligence that's all too often cultivated instead. Thrasymachus, the sophist and villain of Plato's Republic, to Socrates' hero, undoubtedly had a very high IQ. If it would be good to make the cohort of professional philosophers less white and less male, and it would be, that's largely because it would be good to make philosophy itself less white and male, in large part by broadening and altering our epistemic ideals, both by expanding the range of questions we care to ask and by taking seriously diverse perspectives on what constitutes a successful answer to those questions. To conclude, I think something similar can be said about the general topic of this event, Blackness in Appalachian communities, and on our theme, a coming together. Part of the reason encouraging diversity, as opposed to utilizing strictly colorblind selection mechanisms, for instance, is a good thing in all of our communities, is because diverse ways of life are rich breeding grounds for diverse insights and diverse contributions to a shared society. Supporting rich interactions between Black Appalachians and non-Black Appalachians is good for everybody, both good in ways that members of either group might already recognize as good, and good in ways that will only become positioned to see as good through the simple but transformative experience of hanging out, coming together with people who are raised differently than us. Now, reparative justice is often another big part of the reason that increasing diversity is a good thing. But the call for reparative justice assumes that increased diversity in communities and institutions is good for minoritized people, and not only good for the already advantaged. One root cause of diversity's actually being good for everybody is that any human life lived well involves developing a variety of wisdom, an attendant conception of wisdom that's tailored to the idiosyncratic contours of our own life. As Farr puts it, quote, "To know thyself is to know how one is situated in the world, and what that situatedness means in terms of one's ability to be self-determining and to have the necessary resources for self-development," end quote. Over the course of this roundtable, we've heard repeatedly about self-determined Black Appalachian lives that are filled to the brim with their own singular varieties of wisdom, tailored to their unique situations. So there's Dr. Turney's granny who knew her stuff, and I'm especially put in mind of Dr. Smith's question to Dr. Fain this morning. Carving out freedom under oppression requires developing a variety of wisdom that's impossible in other circumstances. It's good for other people to be exposed to that wisdom, but it's also good for Black Appalachians to have access to ways of living, like being a professional philosopher, that allow them to dedicate themselves to reflecting and expounding on the stuff they learned from their grandmothers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Davison and Dr. Jackson for doing what they did for me to participate in this event today. So thank you for the invitation. And to Dr. Farr, I wanted to start off by saying I really enjoyed reading your work. I am going to present interesting perspective in response to his work. I, first and foremost, am not a philosopher.
That's quite all right.
I am primarily gonna just share a perspective that comes from a person who has grew up in the Black church. And number two, I'm a person who has gone through academia, a world that is not from my own culture, and have had to have a double consciousness and survive in it and thrive in it. So it's going to be from those perspectives that I'm going to share today. And I as well have a prepared script. So in the book, Thinking the U.S. South, Contemporary Philosophy from Southern Perspectives, Dr. Arnold Farr contributes a wonderful and eye-opening chapter entitled Beyond Socrates and Grandma on being a Black Southern philosopher. In the chapter, Dr. Farr states that in the philosophical profession, philosophers must engage in the challenging task of critical self-reflection. Philosophers are also encouraged to self-reflect as, quote, disembodied subjects who reflect from nowhere in particular. I concur with Farr's strong conviction that, quote, if philosophy is to provide us with any information about the human condition, the philosopher must take notice of place, form of embodiment, and situation, end quote. Unfortunately, for African-American philosophers in particular, the expectation to regularly self-reflect is a paradoxical exercise due to their place, forms of embodiment, and situation not being acknowledged as valuable sources of wisdom to be added to the hailed philosophical canon created by white men. Blending philosophy with his own personal story, Dr. Farr vividly and wonderfully describes a world that is hostile both to his Blackness and to his being a Southerner. These tensions and hostiles are heightened when Black Southern philosophers work from texts that are generally not recognized by white people as philosophical. Grandma metaphysics is a case in point. Dr. Farr, in your chapter, you coined the phrase metaphysics, which refers to the religious faith of your grandmothers. That faith was vital for their practical engagement with a world that dehumanized them and everyone they loved. You also state that the term grandma metaphysics came to you during a time in which you struggled to explain what seemed to be some form of religious attachment to the spiritual teachings of your grandma, even though you were and am an agnostic. You go on to say that you rejected the abstract religious teachings, but realized that the religious teachings imparted to you by your grandmother and other members of your holding community were deeply rooted in their concrete experience in the struggle for survival. They developed a way of looking at and interpreting the world that made life not only bearable, but also joyful. You go on to also assert that, quote, if philosophy is really going to address the human condition, it must come down to where people live, move, and have their being. I humbly share this afternoon what I'm about to say, but I'm so curious to hear a response and your response as well. And that is, first and foremost, I agree with your quote, Dr. Farr, which comes from Acts chapter 17, verse 22, the part that it must come down to where people live, move, and have their being. But I want to say that our ancestors in the Black church had a faith rooted in a belief in the Spirit of God. They believed that it was from the Spirit they received the strength, faith, and tenacity to endure dehumanizing events not an existential paradigm. And the question I just want to pose is, as an African-American philosopher, how can one exclude the spiritual experience of the Christian faith readily spoken of and displayed in the Black church and simultaneously identify with that particular holding community? I want to just add some commentary to this. My father is a pastor. I'm part of the Black church, but grew up in the Black church. And I learned so much in the Black church that when I started going in academic circles, I already knew what they were talking about. It's just the academic circles gave the names to things I already experienced. So I seen grandmas in church during testimony service get up and speak about God seeing them through, speaking from a place of survival. And from my own experience, they weren't talking from a philosophical place. They often spoke of the Spirit inspiring them and empowering them to endure really situations that were in many cases just impossible to endure, but by the Spirit they were empowered and they got through. So that was, I want to hear more about, from a philosophical perspective, how is it that you were to delineate or separate that, your philosophical bent, and not give credit or praise the spiritual aspect, particularly when you identify with that community and says that it is giving you your sense of self. And I humbly, like I said, philosophy is not my background, but I humbly present this question. I'm curious, and as I said before, I am coming from an experience of being a part of the Black church, and also experiencing that same spirit that has got me through the struggle. And having gone through academia, there are many times when I was confronted with abandoning my identity. I felt like I had to jump through a lot of hoops, you got to play this piece. Well, who's this piece by? It's by somebody I never heard of. Being in a culture where, oh yeah, that improvised music that you're playing, that's not serious art music. But here's the page in front of you, and you have to interpret that and memorize that and really embrace Western European practices. While I look around me and there's no African practices within the music tradition. And if it is, it's supplementary to the curriculum. So my story is, I did both, played the classics, but also played jazz. I can vividly remember my German classical teacher looking at me during a lesson one day as I'm out playing a Beethoven sonata. And she looks at me and says, how is it that you're just able to create? How is it that you're able to sit down at the piano and create? Meaning, in how I grew up, you just show up at the instrument and you play. Oral tradition. Music was passed down from one generation to the next orally, and they would say, you hear that? Listen, imitate. I would go to St. James Church of God in Christ, not the Baptist church, Kojic Church. Yeah. And I would listen to Eddie Howard play, and I would record it, and I would go home and I would listen and imitate. I would call my mom and dad after spending an hour of playing the run that Eddie Howard played and say, listen to this, and it was 30 seconds long. They would come down and they would celebrate me. Thank God for them that they celebrated me and gave me a sense of identity. So much so that when I began to go through these academic circles and saying, seeing these requirements, I got that sense of self-worth from my parents that says you can do anything. And they would say things like, you're going to play better than Eddie Howard. Eddie Howard had a scholarship to the academy, but didn't get through because he couldn't read. But yet he toured the world with Anita Baker. Phenomenal musician. But thank God for mom and dad who said, you're going to do both. And I believe that. And that gave me a sense of identity to jump through all the hoops that I've had to jump through. So I am deeply connected with my holding community. It defines who I am. And I value the other traditions that I've also acquired, but I'm curious, how is it that you identify with a holding community that was affiliated with the Black church that put an emphasis on spirit, but distill it or separate it and focus on the philosophical aspect, the thinking only, not be so much concerned about the God and the spirit of the exodus that got them through, but the thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you both very much. Those were wonderful responses. I got my work cut out for me. So two things. I'll begin with Dr. Curie. Just one thing about Descartes. So yeah, he's guilty of the sin, not the sin of commission, but omission in a way. Whereas you mentioned Hume, Kant, and Hegel, who actually did make several racist claims in some of their works, racist and sexist actually. And Descartes, I guess in a way, my comments about Descartes may be not so much about him, it's about a tradition that comes out of the Cartesian thought, Cartesian I think therefore I am. Right, so there's a tradition that, and even I think John Rawls is part of this too, sure, with the original position going under the veil of ignorance, where you're right to point to Descartes' neurophysiological writings. So there in the neurophysiological writings, you've got something that he's attempted to go beyond human being and just thinking stuff, right? But the idea of human beings as basically thinking stuff, primarily thinking stuff, has sort of, I guess, tainted the history of philosophy for a long time after Descartes, and that was more of my target. Yep. And in a way, Descartes is interesting. I still teach Descartes. When I do my intro level philosophy classes, I always teach Descartes. And one of the problems with the way Descartes is normally taught is you have to put Descartes back in historical context too. And the meditations and the discourse on method, people read those texts in isolation from what he was trying to do. And those texts were actually written to dupe the church, right? And we can talk about that over adult beverages later, right? So a lot of what he says, a lot of what's happening is he's really trying to trick the priests into leaving scientists alone, right? And we can talk about that. That's a long story. We can talk about
agree with everything you just said.
Yeah, so that's why I still love Descartes and I teach him for that reason. Now watch this guy trick the church. Speaking of the church. But I really appreciate those comments. And to be honest, I've been trying to become a Christian again for the last several years. But every time I try to make that move, one of my preaching cousins will say something very stupid and homophobic on Facebook. And I say, screw it. I just go back to ground zero. But no, that's a good question. And it's been a struggle. So those you don't know this, I was at one point in my life a preacher, right? There are preachers in my family. I'm glad you were sitting down. Yeah, so and the preachers of my family, my dad is, my grandfather was before he passed away, uncles, cousins, we were a preaching family. And I did it, man. Yeah. I went to seminary and it was after college, I went to seminary for 2 years. And it was in my first semester of seminary that I failed from grace. I actually became an atheist. I was atheist before agnostic. I became an atheist my first semester in seminary. And the weird thing is, I prayed when I became an atheist. And I was walking in the parking lot of the seminary, and I made a decision to become an atheist. And I told God, I said, look, if you're real, and if what all the Christians say about you is true, you know why I'm doing this. And in time, you'll bring me back if you're real. And so that's where I left it. Boy, my family gave me hell, all right? Because I was preaching, I quit preaching, I left the church and the seminary, and I got hell for several years, right? And my maternal grandmother, I love her so much. She just passed away 2 years ago. Boy, we fought. And she'd get on you, man. She always had a way of shutting you down, right? So she'll say something to you, and she frames it so you can't answer back. And I always did anyway. But she'll say something, child, the Lord told me to tell you, right? And so the Lord told her to tell me. There's nothing for me to say, right? So I went through this thing several years with my family, and I'm still a part of that holding community because even though I'm not church and I don't identify as Christian, there are still fundamental things that they taught me that I do hold on to. And I think there's some fundamental beliefs and ideas that I learned from my family that I can still hold on to and not buy everything, right? And I think over a period of time, so we had that several years of tension, but over a period of time, I think there was a moment when I kind of felt outside of the holding community. I felt a little bit like I had lost it, right? But I continued to go back home to visit. I continued to love them, and I know they loved me. And when they came after me, like my maternal grandmother did, I knew it was out of love, right? And I knew that was out of love, and I knew I was going to go back to graduate school, wherever it was at the time, and continue with my life. And I think over a period of some years, once they saw what I ended up doing and the kind of person I became, they were less stressed out about me being non-church. And so there's a moment of, I think there's been healing and reconciliation for sure, right? And I'll go back now, man, I still, and I say existential connection because I mean this sort of a deep feeling of connection to the church in a way, but there's a theological distance because there are a lot of ideas I don't believe, I don't buy. And I think for the most part, well, if the church were more in line with liberation theology, I could be more of a part of it. I do. In fact, I'm writing a book on James Cone right now. So I am impacted by liberation theology.
Can you publish that with WVU Press?
Who said that? Who said that? Will you do it? I'm looking for a press. I'll talk to you. We'll be talking. Yeah. And in fact, a lot of stuff we're talking about now, like Black consciousness and that kind of stuff, I deal with. So yeah, I'll talk to you. But I started, you know, when I left the church, I remember giving away all my theology books and that kind of thing. And I didn't go to church. And I started back when my dad got a new church. I guess he's been at that church about 15 years. So I go to church basically twice a year because when I go visit my mom and dad, that's their life, right? And they're going to church, and I'm not going to sit at the house and not be with them. So I go be with them. And I've actually become, I love that church. I've become good friends with the members there. And I'm like one of them when I go. So that's been nice. And I started back reading theology in the Bible again, actually in 2018, because I think part of me is still Christian in a fundamental way, but then part of me don't want to call myself that, because what does that mean? What does it represent, right? And when I say I'm a Christian, am I identifying with that person who says he or she's a Christian in their ways, and that person in their ways, that person in their ways, right? So there's a kind of I think about 2 months ago, I finally decided what I was, and I changed it again. I decided I was a Black revolutionary Christian agnostic. Then I just, and then And then one of my cousins said something stupid on Facebook, and I said, I dropped the Christian part again. And so, but I would love to talk more about that, because that is actually it's not something that's settled, right? It's a real live struggle that I'm going through right now, right? And I don't know where it's going to come out, when it's going to end, but it's and especially it sort of reached a high point in 2018 for whatever reason. And I've been really studying theology series again since 2018. No commitment yet. I'm very careful about that, right? Because I'm very concerned about if I call myself Christian, who am I identifying with, right? And I do think I'm kind of a non-Christian Jesus freak in a way. That's another thing. What is that, right? Because I do think there's something fundamentally right about the teachings of Jesus that's actually left out of most churches, and it doesn't really go deep enough. And I kind of want to we'll talk.
It sounds like a couple books up in there, right? We got a couple books. So I want to open it up for what time we have left for questions. And I do want to pose like a general question, if it's okay, to the panel and just into the room. And so one of the things, and one of the reasons I asked you to be here, Dr. Farr, was because I thought that that you would give us an opportunity to really kind of think about the complex association between what I think of as an outsider, the complex association between Black Southern identity and Black Appalachian identity, right? And so I was hoping that maybe in this space, there could be someone who could at least help us to begin to think about these two identities, right? And how they merge, how they diverge, right? And how one might cancel out the other, what one might claim, what one might not claim. Right. And so I don't know if anyone has any just fleeting thoughts, early thoughts on this. What I'm looking at as a complex association between Black Southern identity and Black Appalachian identity. Right. Can I just put that out there as a thing? Okay.
So Scallywag is a pretty awesome place to start to, they're starting to unpack Southern identity and Black Appalachian identity, online publication, dope publication. And then also Freedom Ways, which is a division of Press On, is starting to explore Black Southern identity and Appalachian identity. And these are two publications that are working to and looking for people to tell these stories and to just start to unpack it. It's Press On, Freedom Ways.
Can I, Nkechi, you want to jump in?
I'm thinking.
Okay, I saw your hand reach back.
It was going up, and then I was like, do I want to think through it?
Okay, okay.
So in conversation last night with Amina, we had dinner with, and then I'm also thinking of Karita Brown's book, Gone Home, Race and what's the Race and Place Through Appalachia, something like that. Yeah, but Gone Home with UNC Press. So Karita writes about her family coming from Alabama to the coal fields of Harlan County. Dr. Turner has a similar story. Amina's family has a story of Black Southerners moving to Appalachia, to West Virginia for work. So that's definitely I think that's a part of the history, is the labor history and how people were moving for work and the developing cultures in those new places.
I'll take a shot now. All right. So I think about many Southern identities, right? So an Appalachian South can be a type of South, right? But if we think of like the work of Zandria Robinson and Marcus Hunter, they push us even further to think of everything on the Canada border as the South, right? And the ways that people take their Southern identity with them, regardless of where they are. So there can be an up South, a West South, a down South. In my work, I argue that Appalachia is way up South, right? And so I think that that's a part of it as well. Another piece.
I have one or two comments. I think one thing that Appalachia and the South have in common is both are victims of stereotypes, right? Stereotypes of people who don't know anything about either region and don't spend much time, or haven't spent much time in either region. But one thing that comes to mind is I appreciate what you said about the up south. I do see Appalachia as being more up south, and that creates a bit of a difference. But another thing too is Appalachia has this coal history that the rest of the South doesn't share. And I think that the history of the coal mines and people black and white being involved in the coal mines and the whole story and the way in which lives were settled then unsettled through a history of working in the coal mines. And that's a story that people in Appalachia have that I think other Southerners do not have. And that's kind of a bonding element. I think when you talk to black and white people in Appalachia, and I'm a part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival. And I've got to learn a lot about Kentucky and Appalachia. When William Barber would come through, we'd go to Harlan County and spend time in Harlan County. And when they were doing the train guys were occupying the track a couple of years ago, I went down and spent time with them there and just sort of learn more about the history of coal and the mines and the way in which the relationships between black and whites who were working in the coal mines sort of different in some ways than the relationships in other parts of the South because of their bonding around the work and the danger they experienced together in the coal mines.
Other questions, please. Comments?
More of like a comment or a response, I guess, to Mr. Merrill's question to Mr. Farr, kind of about how you identify or like hold on to one practice, but you are away from it as well. I think I kind of fall in that place, just to give my background from it. I'm 24, so I'm a little younger, so clearly, but I can say from growing up, my grandmother always instilled those things into me. I would always go to church every Saturday, sometimes Sunday. I would do it all. I was as Christian as you could possibly get, whatever that means. But I think at one point in time, as I got older, I started to kind of create my own questions. And my uncle is a preacher and a priest, and I would ask him questions and it was just no answer. So I think that when I started to get to that part of my life, that is where I started to kind of phase away from the religion. But there are certain things that like I do still hold on to, as Mr. Farr says, like just for example, like ushering, something as simple as that, holding open the door. You can ask my girlfriend, she never holds open the door. I don't think I got that. I don't think I got that from chivalry or anything, but I know I learned that in the church, and those are certain things and ideals and stuff that I learned. So I just wanted to comment on that kind of from a younger perspective. I don't think that Mr. Farr is necessarily saying that the religion itself is wrong or anything like that. But I think that when you do get older and you start to formulate your own questions and a mindset, that there are things that I think everyone can agree that you do question in the Bible at any time. I think, like, for example, when my grandmother and everyone explained to me, you're always supposed to go to God when you're in like a time of like a troubled state or a good place, and you're supposed to give thanks for him. But there was never a time where I would hear about that middle ground, right? About when do you keep talking to God and when God makes himself known. And I, again, talked to my uncle about that, and eventually got to the point where he would just, the answer was like, well, it's a given. Well, it's not always a given, because if it was a given, we would all know what our version of God looks like, or our version of religion or whatever it is. And it's not that clear cut. So I just wanted to kind of give my perspective on that, if that helps settle any in between ground that either one was on.
Lupe, can I respond? In order for a car to work, there has to be gas, right? Within the Black church community, the emphasis was, if you will, on the gas, not the car. Gas is synonymous with spirit. And they claimed that it was spirit that allowed them to get through unbearable situations. That is the only thing that I'm raising, and not whether or not how religious somebody is, not the church institution, because one can be one with spirit without the institution. You mentioned, I'll just leave it there, but that's the point that I'm raising, and I'm saying is the hallmark of the identity rooted in the Black church, in the Black community. It's, to me, it's spirit, Black community is one. So my question is how can you take the car but not the gas?
I'm ready. I can do that.
Okay. But grandma had wisdom though.
My driving force to even get it in church and everything in the beginning. So when those things start to fade as people pass on and stuff like that, you not necessarily run out of gas, but you start questioning, did you need it in the first place, or was it someone else that was just providing those things free and whole? And again, I totally agree with both sides. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying my perspective of it, of why I've kind of stepped away from things, is because, like I said, it's really hard to go home, to your parents or your grandparents and get smacked upside the head when you hear that you're not in the church anymore. I never did that. My father, he was really accepting of it, but it's just, as you slowly get older, I think that if your heart is not fully in there and you don't have that support group that you originally came into it with, it's kind of hard to stay around in certain things. And church or school, it could be anything. So that's just my perspective.
Oh, man. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. I wanted to reflect back on an earlier conversation that we had today, built around Dr. Smith's work in Charleston. And I feel like what has opened up in this conversation is a conversation about the kind of knowledges that the secular university, we'll just say, does not train students to have. Doesn't train faculty to have, doesn't train PhD students to have. And you can see just in the richness of this conversation right now, like the depth of a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of commitment to something over a long period of time that many people in communities, not just in Appalachia in the South, but globally, right, have a sense of. Not just Christianity, but many different spiritual traditions. And so I think that it raises questions about the way in which the university is structured and the kinds of conversations we have with students in the classroom, right? Because these are this is within a secular university, taboo to have conversations that are direct like this, right? Even on a panel, it seems taboo, kind of awkward, right? But when I'm doing research in communities, when I'm meeting with people in communities, when I'm talking to students, at a certain point, God comes up. And so I think that when we contemplate maybe the future of this conversation, thinking in a post-secular way, or I don't know if that's even a thing, maybe that makes it philosophical. And
maybe a comment. I'm curious, as for the panelists to share, do they see this as a must? Shape the kind of conversation we're having.
Yeah, I think we can. I've been working on a project for the last several years. I actually gave a paper in Brazil. I guess it was right before COVID. Must have been, I don't know, maybe fall of 2019 before COVID. I don't remember what the paper was called, but it was the first paper of its sort for me. I was attempting to, so what I was trying to do in the paper was construct what I call critical political theology. Right.
Wow.
And what I mean by that is when you think about theology, theology is the theologian is one who belongs to a particular religious community and has two particular functions. One is to clarify the meaning of the faith for the believers in that community, and also to function as an apologist to defend the faith against the enemies, opponents of the faith, right?
Yeah.
And so the question is, can someone who's not a member of a particular religion be a theologian? And my answer is yes, with a new function, that religion is a real thing out there in the world. And it really does, and it does something. It has an impact, right? And one can, even from an atheistic or agnostic position, study this phenomenon in the world and try to understand what is it doing? How is it functioning, right? Is it functioning in an oppressive way or a liberatory way, right? And it becomes an object of study. And I think it's essential that we do something like that, because religion is doing real stuff, right? Some of it's not so good and some of it's great, right? And how do we distinguish between the two and seek to build a more, whatever religion we're talking about, a more positive version of it, right? And along these lines, we're talking about the Black church in some ways too. I meant to say earlier, there are actually two Black churches, right? I'm not talking about denominations. It goes back to, James Cone talks about this, and the Black church historian, C. Eric Lincoln talks about this. He talks about the fact that during the Great Awakening, there was a discussion among slave owners as to whether or not they should make their slaves Christian. And they split into two groups, right? One group argued that, well, we should make them Christian. They become Christian, they become more docile and easier to manage. The other group argued that no, if they become Christian, they're going to think they are brothers and sisters in Christ, and they're going to insist on freedom. Well, both were right, right? And as slaves became Christian, you do have, I think for the most part, the earlier Black church was more like the Spirit liberated them and they depended on the Spirit to get them through. And the earlier Black church was more likely to be rebellious. And that's a story that's not really told much, right? The rebellion by members of the early Black church, and it wasn't a one-time thing, right? They were constantly rebelling, right? There are a lot of stories of slave rebellions out of the Black church, but eventually over time, I think that form of Black Christianity diminished a little bit. It's not gone, but it's diminished. And what is flourished is the form where people are more docile. So, one thing that frustrates me with the church is there's a lot of God talk, right? And everybody's blessed, that's good, but there's no critique. And if you begin a social critique, right? This is where you're complaining, you're not complaining, you've been blessed. I'm not complaining. I love my life. I'm living my best life, right? But there are people suffering, right? The prophets, the Old Testament prophets, address those issues, right? And the vast majority of our church leaders are not addressing the issues that the Old Testament prophets address. But they will walk up to the political leaders and say, "Woe art thou for what you're doing to the women and children," right? And where is that? When I go to church, I don't see it. My cousins aren't doing it. Right? They bitch about the LGBT community.
I hear you. I hear you. I hear you. Wow.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.